One afternoon in mid-July 2014, 59-year-old Jack Parks and his fiancée, Carol LaPaya, walked through their neighborhood of Kennedy Township, Pennsylvania. Jack sported a black fedora, wireframe glasses, and a lopsided grin beneath a graying mustache. Carol hung on his arm, smiling at how her engagement ring sparkled in the sunlight. As they walked, they passed by several neighbors who were outside doing yard work or talking. Jack and Carol waved to each person as they passed, and everyone waved back. Their neighborhood was a close-knit, working-class community 10 miles outside of Pittsburgh, and everybody seemed to know each other. In fact, Jack even had family on this street. One of his nephews, Bradley Johnson, lived nearby. As Jack and Carol passed by Bradley's house, Jack slowed down, trying to see if Bradley was home. His nephew had mentioned wanting to talk to him in person about something serious and urgent, but Jack could see that the house was empty, so that conversation would have to wait. Which was fine, because today, Jack and Carol were on a mission. Inside of Carol's purse was a large stack of wedding invitations, and they were on their way to drop these invitations in the mail, which was huge for them, because their wedding had been an unusually long time coming. So Jack and Carol had met at a bar 25 years ago. They'd fallen for each other quickly, but Jack had dragged his feet on proposing. And then, when he had felt ready, Carol was swamped at work. Then Jack was busy. The timing was just always bad, and the longer they put marriage off, the less important it seemed. And anyways, they were in love and totally committed to each other. They didn't need a marriage license to prove that. But last February, Jack's mother had passed away. Her death had made him realize that he wasn't getting any younger, and he really wanted to marry the woman he'd loved for decades. So, a few months ago, he'd finally proposed. And ever since, their days had been consumed with wedding preparations. They had the venue, the dress, and the rings, and now it was finally time to send out the invitations. The couple came to the end of the block and stopped in front of the mailbox. Carol took the envelopes from her purse and then joked that this was their last chance to cross anyone off their invite list. Jack just laughed and said they were not cutting anyone. So Carol pushed the envelopes through the mailbox slot until only one invitation remained. Carol hesitated for a second, looking at the name on that last envelope. It was her nephew, a 22-year-old named Michael LaPaya. She and Jack had been angry at Michael this whole past year. Their broken relationship with him was a sore spot for both of them. So Jack and Carol did not have children of their own, but they'd always doted on their nieces and nephews. When the kids were younger, Jack and Carol would have them over for slumber parties where they'd stay up late watching movies and eating popcorn, and as the kids got older, they'd all stayed close, except for Michael. A few years back, Michael had started drifting away from Jack and Carol and the rest of the family, and getting into lots of trouble. He joined the army, but gotten dishonorably discharged for marijuana possession, and ever since, he'd suffered from PTSD and began experimenting with harder drugs. But that was actually not what caused the rift. Jack and Carol had supported Michael, even through his struggles, until one day the previous September. During a Labor Day party that Jack and Carol had hosted, guests had seen Michael go into the couple's bedroom. And when the party was over, Carol had discovered that her expensive jewelry was missing. Jack and Carol had confronted Michael, who denied taking anything, but they hadn't believed him. They told him he was no longer welcome in their home, and things had been extremely tense between them ever since. But now, Jack and Carol were ready to make amends by inviting Michael to their wedding. So, standing on the sidewalk, Carol took a deep breath and then dropped Michael's invitation into the mailbox. And suddenly, both Jack and Carol felt a whole lot lighter. The invitations were out, and good things were ahead. Jack and Carol turned away from the mailbox and began heading back home. As they reached their driveway, Jack waved to a few men standing directly across the street, outside of a small factory called Silver Star Meats. The workers were outside in their aprons smoking, and they waved back. Jack was about to go over and talk to them when he noticed Carol's irritated expression, and so he thought better of it. Jack liked the guys from the factory, but he knew they made Carol uncomfortable. She hated that they took their smoke breaks so close to their house, and she thought their blood-stained aprons were kind of unsettling. So Jack just turned away, and then he and Carol walked up their porch steps and into their house. A few days later, on Monday, July 21st, Carol sat at her desk at work, reviewing her to-do list for the wedding. The ceremony was just 6 weeks away, and there was still a lot to figure out. But then, at 10:45 a.m., her cell phone rang. And to her surprise, it was Jack's realtor. Jack had hired this realtor to sell his mother's house after she had died, and now the realtor said some potential buyers wanted to see the house that afternoon. She wanted Jack and Carol to meet her there at 4 p.m. This was all good news, because Carol and Jack had been eager to sell that house as quickly as possible. But before hanging up, Carol asked why the realtor called her instead of calling Jack. The realtor said they did call Jack first. He just didn't answer. This seemed odd to Carol. As soon as she hung up, she tried Jack's cell phone, and it rang several times before going to voicemail. She left him a message, then hung up and called the house. And as it rang, she expected to hear Jack's voice any second, but again, the call went to voicemail. Carol just sat there, trying to ignore the sick feeling of dread in her stomach. Jack knew what a worrier she could be, so he always answered her calls. But she told herself that maybe he was in the shower, or maybe outside mowing the grass without his phone on him. He would probably call her back any minute. But the clock kept ticking, and by noon, Jack still had not called. And so Carol tried him again, but he still didn't answer. Frustrated, she dropped her phone back in her purse and just focused on her computer, trying to ignore her mounting anxiety. But by 2:30 p.m., when still Jack had not called, so now it's been 3.5 hours since that first missed call, Carol just couldn't take it anymore. So she left work and began heading straight home. 20 minutes later, Carol pulled up outside of her and Jack's house. And right away, she saw that the garage door was open and Jack's car was inside, which meant he had to be home. Carol felt relieved. She was sure Jack would explain why he had missed her calls, and better yet, they'd still be able to make their 4 p.m. appointment with their realtor. But as Carol got out of her car and started up the walkway, she saw something that made her stomach drop all over again. So Jack and Carol's front porch was enclosed by a gate, and both Jack and Carol always kept the gate closed because their dog was a runner, and they wanted to make sure he didn't get out. But now Carol saw the gate was wide open. Carol rushed through the gate to the front door and turned the knob. But even though the doorknob turned, meaning it was unlocked, the door didn't budge when she pushed on it. That's when Carol realized the deadbolt inside, which they never used, must be locked. And now her anxiety turned to actual fear. Between the deadbolt, the open gate, and Jack not answering his phone, she was certain something had to be wrong here. Carol's hands shook as she dug through her purse for the house key, then struggled to get it into the lock. Finally she did, the deadbolt turned, and the door swung open. Carol stepped inside with her heart pounding, but the house was silent and still. She took a few steps further in, and then her eyes suddenly fell on something under the coffee table inside of the living room. For a second, her brain couldn't even compute what she was looking at. But then, when it clicked, she let out a scream. Because underneath the coffee table was Jack. He was lying face down on the carpet with a pool of blood under his head. Carol rushed over to Jack and shook him, but he didn't move or make a sound. And so in a panic, she found her phone and dialed 911. When the dispatcher picked up, Carol shouted that there'd been some kind of horrible accident. Her fiancé must have fallen and hit his head on the coffee table, and she begged the dispatcher to please send help now. Moments later, police and first responders arrived, and they had to physically drag Carol away from Jack's side. Carol watched as they knelt beside her fiancé and checked for a pulse, but they didn't find one. Carol's world crumbled. She knew Jack was dead. A short while later, Detective Lori McKeel of the Allegheny County Homicide Unit arrived on the scene. A perimeter was already established, and the house was crawling with police. But before McKeel went in, she looked around outside. Neighbors were watching the activity from their front lawns, and McKeel noticed a specific group of people huddled together on the sidewalk. consoling a sobbing woman whose hands were covered in blood. McKeel guessed this must be the victim's partner, and the people around her were her family. But before speaking to her, the detective quickly made her way across the yard and went inside of the house. Inside, officers and forensic techs searched the front room for evidence. McKeel had already been briefed on this case, so she knew the victim's name was Jack Parks, and his fiancée had found him dead after an apparent fall. McKeel went into the living room, where Jack's body lay face up, partially underneath the coffee table. There was a lot of blood, and at first glance, a fall didn't seem out of the question. However, when she crouched down to get a better look, she found a small hole behind Jack's right ear, toward the back of his skull. It was a gunshot wound, which meant this was no accidental fall. This was a murder. McKeel stood up and told the other investigators nearby to keep their eyes peeled for bullet casings or a gun. Then she continued scanning the house. The house was lived in, but relatively neat, with boxes of what looked like wedding favors stacked in the hall. But when McKeel stepped inside of the master bedroom, she saw this room had been totally ransacked. Dressers were overturned and drawers were pulled out. Several jewelry boxes lay empty and discarded on the carpet. Either this was a robbery, or someone had staged the scene to make it look like one. As McKeel made her way back to the living room, she saw several photos of what looked like a seemingly loving couple about to get married. But McKeel's training told her not to take anything at face value. Every relationship had its problems, and a deadline like a wedding could bring tension to the surface. So before McKeel did anything else, she wanted to speak to Jack's fiancé. If there were any skeletons in the couple's closet, she needed to know about them. Later that afternoon, Detective McKeel sat with Carol in an interview room at the police station. McKeel knew that so far, nobody had told Carol much of anything, including the fact that Jack's death was a murder, not an accidental fall. And from McKeel's point of view, this was a good thing. The romantic partner was always the primary suspect in a murder. And so McKeel wanted to study how Carol behaved in their interview before she told Carol anything about the investigation. So McKeel started slowly, asking basic questions about Carol's relationship with Jack. But as Carol calmed down and opened up, McKeel began to probe deeper. She asked if either Carol or Jack was getting cold feet about their wedding, and why did it take them so long to get engaged? Were there suspicions of infidelity? What about money problems? McKeel watched Carol for any hint of defensiveness or anger. But while Carol did deny having any problems with Jack, she didn't seem mad at being asked about it. She just seemed confused. So, McKeel decided to ask a question that she knew would increase the pressure, by making it obvious that Carol was now a suspect in a murder. The detective looked into Carol's eyes and asked her if she owned a gun. And at this, Carol froze. After a second, she asked why she was being questioned about a gun when her fiancé had fallen. McKeel stayed quiet and watched as Carol's expression changed from confusion to understanding. Carol just looked at McKeel and said, "Are you saying Jack was shot?" And then, Carol just began sobbing. Even though McKeel could not officially rule Carol out as a suspect yet, she did think Carol's reaction to this was very genuine. So McKeel handed Carol a box of tissues and asked in a gentle voice if Jack had any enemies. Through tears, Carol said no. In fact, if anything, Jack was sometimes too friendly. Recently, Carol said she'd come home to find Jack hanging out in the living room with one of the workers from the factory across the street. Carol said she'd been mad at him for letting a stranger inside of their home. And then after that, Carol just broke into more sobs. McKeel narrowed her eyes as she thought back to Jack and Carol's ransacked bedroom. Crime scene techs were still processing the scene, but it had looked like theft was at least part of the motive. So if Jack really had no enemies and his murder was not personal, then this being a robbery by a stranger, like a factory worker, was a definite possibility. McKeel knew that if Jack and Carol's home really had been robbed during this murder, then whoever did the robbery would likely try to unload the stolen goods quickly. And the easiest way to do that was to sell them to a local pawn shop. So, the day after Jack's murder, McKeel got a list of the items missing from Jack and Carol's home, which included several expensive watches, rings, and other pieces of jewelry, and contacted every pawn shop in the immediate area. But none of them claimed to have any of the missing jewelry yet, so McKeel left descriptions of the items along with their number. McKeel also contacted the City of Pittsburgh Pawn Division, which kept an extensive database of pawned items, and gave them descriptions of the stolen jewelry as well. It was sort of like she was fishing, and so McKeel knew she had to be patient. So, while she waited to hear back, she began looking into the workers from the Silver Star Meats Factory. Within a few days of the murder, McKeel led a team of officers to that factory. And as soon as she stepped out of her car, she could see that anybody standing right outside of the factory would have a clear view of Jack and Carol's front door and garage. From speaking to Carol, she knew Jack had been friendly with several factory employees, and on at least one occasion had invited them into his home. And so those types of visits would have been perfect opportunities to learn the layout of Jack and Carol's house and to figure out where they kept their valuables. Once inside the factory, McKeel and her officers began interviewing close to 40 workers, one by one. And pretty quickly, they identified the man who'd been invited by Jack into their home. His name was Ronald Blevins, and he had a criminal history of petty theft and assault. To McKeel, this was promising. But Blevins had not been at work on the day of Jack's murder because he was on a scheduled vacation. Now, McKeel did not think this made him any less of a suspect, but this early in the case, there wasn't any physical evidence to connect him to the crime, so she couldn't arrest him. As McKeel and her team left the meat factory, she felt a bit deflated. She really needed the forensics to come back if she was going to make any real progress on this case. Fortunately, though, there would be new evidence for her waiting back at the station. A copy of Jack's autopsy report was sitting on McKeel's desk. She opened it and began reading. And right away, she saw something important. Other than the gunshot wound, there were no bruises or scratches found anywhere on Jack's body. There was no sign of a struggle at all. And so McKeel knew this could mean that the killer broke into the house and then surprised Jack and shot him from behind, or it could mean Jack knew his killer and had let this person inside of his house. McKeel kept on reading the report, and as she got towards the end of it, her eyes went wide. The coroner had made a major discovery. A bullet had been extracted from Jack's skull, and they determined it came from a .380 caliber handgun. This was extremely helpful. McKeel still did not have the actual murder weapon, but now she knew what kind of gun she was looking for. And so she wanted to find out if somebody close to Jack, someone let's say he would have welcomed into his home, owned a gun like that. Over the next few days, Detective McKeel interviewed Jack's friends and family, and most of them echoed Carol's comments that Jack got along with everybody, and no one McKeel met with claimed to own a .380 caliber handgun. And so McKeel felt like she was quickly running into yet another dead end. That was until a few people mentioned a fight Jack had had with Carol's nephew at a Labor Day party. And also folks mentioned that one of Jack's nephews, so a different nephew, was looking to hash out a serious and urgent matter with his uncle in the days right before the murder. The people who mentioned those two nephews said that the nephews had been really close with Jack for most of their lives. But McKeel knew those relationships could have turned bad as soon as jewelry or money got involved. So she went to interview both men immediately. The first house she went to belonged to Carol's nephew, Michael Lapaya, the Army veteran who Jack and Carol had accused of stealing at their Labor Day party. When she began questioning Michael, he didn't deny that he and his uncle had a falling out. But he also insisted Jack was wrong about him stealing. More importantly, though, Michael denied having anything to do with Jack's death. He said he'd been busy on the day of the murder, at a doctor's appointment to treat his PTSD, and then he had also gone shopping with his girlfriend. And he showed McKeel receipts to prove it. And also, Michael did admit that he had lots of guns, and he knew how to use them after his time in the military. However, the one gun he didn't own was a .380 caliber handgun. After the interview, McKeel contacted the Veterans Affairs Medical Center and confirmed that Michael attended his appointment on the day of the murder. She was also able to verify that charges had been made on his credit card in a different city around the time of Jack's death. All in all, Michael's alibi seemed solid. So, Detective McKeel headed back to Jack and Carol's neighborhood to meet with the second nephew that Jack's friends and family had mentioned. This was Jack's nephew, Bradley, the one who lived on the same street and had been apparently wanting to speak with Jack in person about something serious and urgent. Now, from what other people had already told her, McKeel knew Bradley was mad at Jack for selling his mother's house, because Bradley thought the property should stay in the family. She also knew Bradley and Carol didn't really get along. To McKeel, this sounded like a pretty deep-rooted dispute, and she expected Bradley to be cagey when they spoke about it. However, once they sat down at Bradley's kitchen table, what Bradley actually said blew McKeel away. Right off the bat, Bradley said that at 10:30 a.m. on July 21st, which was the day of the murder, he'd waited until Carol had left for work and then walked over to Jack's house to confront him. Bradley said once Jack let him inside, he'd immediately asked Jack to halt the sale of his grandmother's house. Bradley was struggling financially and wanted to move into his grandmother's house with his girlfriend to save money. Bradley said Jack seemed open to the idea, but he refused to make a decision right then because he wanted to speak to Carol first. And at that point, Bradley knew he was not going to get the house, because he knew Carol would not like the idea and she would convince Jack to keep trying to sell the house. So Bradley told McKeel he'd just given up and left Jack's house sometime around 11:15 a.m., a little more than 3 hours before Carol would arrive home and find Jack dead. As Bradley finished up the story, McKeel was stunned silent. Bradley had just openly confessed to being inside of Jack's home, alone with him, on the day Jack died. And also, Bradley admitted that he had been there arguing over a property worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. But, amazingly, Bradley still wasn't done with his story. Just as McKeel was about to leave, he casually revealed one more fact. He told her that he did in fact own a .380 caliber handgun. McKeel confiscated Bradley's gun, then raced back to the station to have it analyzed by the ballistics lab to see if it was the murder weapon. It would take a while for the results to come in, but McKeel barely had to wait before she got another huge break in the case. That day, a member of McKeel's team told her he'd finally received a call back from a pawnshop owner in a nearby town. According to that owner, a young couple had come into their shop on July 21st, the day of Jack's murder. And this couple had wanted to sell a bunch of jewelry, including gold chains and rings. And the owner noticed that several of these pieces had been smashed and mangled, which made the owner suspect that these could be stolen. And so as a result, he had not purchased these pieces of jewelry, but he'd convinced the couple to let him take a few photos of the jewelry, and then after the couple left, he contacted the police in the area. And it had taken 3 days for those police to connect the incident to Jack's case and then get in touch with McKeel's team. But as soon as McKeel got this news, she went straight to the pawn shop to review the photos of the potentially stolen items. And when she saw these photos, there was no doubt that was Jack's jewelry. Now, this pawn shop did not have a security camera, so there was no footage of the couple who tried to sell Jack's stuff. But McKeel showed the pawn shop owner some photos of local criminals along with dozens of people of interest in Jack's murder case, which included Jack's nephew Bradley. And as these pictures were being shown, the owner suddenly stopped McKeel and pointed out one person in particular and said, "Yep, that's the man I saw." And to McKeel's surprise, it was not Bradley. The man the pawnshop owner picked out was named Brian Gibbons. He had a record of theft, and the police knew of him, but they hadn't remotely considered him as a suspect in Jack's murder because Brian had no known connections to Jack. But now, armed with this new information, McKeel left the pawn shop and headed to Brian's house. And as soon as Brian saw her, McKeel could tell she'd taken him by surprise. Brian denied having any knowledge of the murder, but when McKeel looked in his bedroom, It was absolutely littered with purses and jewelry. None of the items belonged to Jack or Carol, but a lot of the stuff had been reported stolen. This meant McKeel could charge Brian and hold him in custody while she looked for a connection to Jack's case. And so that's what McKeel did. She arrested Brian for theft. However, she still wasn't totally sure if he'd actually played a role in Jack's murder. McKeel had basically convinced herself that Jack's nephew, Bradley, was the killer. But now, Brian had come out of left field, and he seemed like an equally strong suspect. And so McKeel wondered if maybe these two men had worked together, with Bradley actually committing the crime and then passing off the jewelry to Brian to sell. But McKeel had no evidence that these two men even knew each other. And until the ballistics results came back, she didn't even know if Bradley's gun was the murder weapon. It was like suddenly McKeel had gone from having a case full of dead ends to having a case with too many good suspects. It would take another week before the final piece of evidence fell into place. On August 4th, 2 weeks after Jack's death, McKeel got a call about a second pawn shop, where a young man had stopped in the day after the murder trying to sell a bunch of damaged jewelry. Unlike at the first pawn shop, the employee at this one had not realized the jewelry was stolen, so he had bought it. Police had already examined the jewelry and confirmed it belonged to Jack. But the most important thing about this pawn shop was that it did have a security camera. And when McKeel watched that footage, she knew who killed Jack. Based on that surveillance footage, evidence collected at the crime scene, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Jack Parks on the morning of July 21st, 2014. That morning, the killer woke up in agony. They lay in bed for several minutes, drenched in sweat. Their cramps were getting worse. And beneath the pain, a horrible, clawing hunger was growing, demanding to be fed. From the next room, their partner shouted that they were heading off to work. At this, the killer scrambled up, yelling for their partner to wait. The killer dragged themselves out of bed and stumbled from the room. With a wild look on their face, they told their partner to call in sick today. They were going for a ride. A short while later, at about noon, the couple pulled up to the curb 1 block from the Silver Star Meats factory. The killer eyed the house directly across from the factory. The garage was open, and Jack's car was inside. He was home. The killer reached inside the glove box and took out a .380 caliber handgun. They told their partner to drive away if they weren't back in 30 minutes. Then they pocketed the gun, pulled the hood of their sweatshirt over their head, and got out of the car. The killer's heart pounded as they hurried down the sidewalk, avoiding eye contact with the meat factory employees, just standing about in their blood-stained aprons. The killer reached Jack's house, headed up the walkway, went through the front gate, and right to the door. They knocked and then waited. When no one answered, they urgently knocked again. The door opened. Jack looked out and quickly waved the killer inside. Jack turned away from the door and asked the killer if he could get them something to drink. But the killer didn't answer. Instead, they followed Jack through the doorway and into the front room, and there, they stopped, drew the gun from their pocket, raised the barrel just inches from Jack's right ear, and fired. The bullet struck Jack in the back of the head. He fell, dead before he even touched the ground. And immediately, the killer bolted upstairs to the master bedroom, where they tore through the dresser, ripping out drawers and dumping the contents all over the floor. It didn't take long to find what they were looking for. They quickly dug through the room and found Carol's jewelry box and Jack's rings, chains, and watches. The killer stuck the items into the pockets of their sweatshirt, feeling a thrill of victory. Soon, that gnawing hunger would be satisfied. The pain would end. Then, the phone in the house began to ring, and the killer just froze. The killer listened as the call went to voicemail. Carol's voice echoed from the machine, asking why Jack wasn't picking up his cell phone, telling him that somebody was interested in buying his mother's house, and they needed to get there by 4 p.m. to open it up. Then Carol said she loved him and hung up. As soon as the voicemail ended, the killer rushed back downstairs to the front door. They grabbed the key off an end table to lock the deadbolt, but then something caught their eye. And once again, they froze. The killer saw Jack's feet jutting out from behind the coffee table. Beyond that, the killer saw the whole living room. It was a place with a lot of happy memories, where they, the killer, had spent countless slumber parties eating popcorn and watching movies with their cousins. A lump began to form in the killer's throat as they looked at a particular photo on the wall. Their 10-year-old self was smiling right back at them. The killer looked down at the floor, said goodbye to their Uncle Jack, and left. Jack's nephew, Bradley Johnson, had been high on Detective McKeel's suspect list. But when the results of the ballistics test on Bradley's .380 caliber handgun came back, it did not match the murder weapon. Also, at that second pawn shop where they had surveillance footage, it was not Bradley who McKeel saw, because Bradley didn't kill his uncle. Carol's nephew, the disgraced Army veteran Michael LaPaya, did. It would turn out Michael had been really struggling since his dishonorable discharge from the Army, even worse than some of his family knew. He'd started using heroin and begun stealing to support the habit. And as his addiction worsened, Michael became increasingly desperate for cash. And in July 2014, he saw a quick way to get it, by killing Uncle Jack and stealing his jewelry. Jewelry Michael pawned the next day for just a little over $1,000. Once Detective McKeel saw Michael on that pawn shop surveillance footage, she was sure she'd found Jack's killer. And soon after that, she dug into Michael's phone records and discovered that his phone had pinged off a cell phone tower near Jack's house around the time of the murder, not long before Michael had gone shopping with his girlfriend and to his medical appointment just to give himself an alibi. Eventually, Michael would confess to what he'd done. Michael was convicted of first-degree murder and received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. His girlfriend and alleged getaway driver was never charged. As for Brian Gibbons, the jewelry thief who Detective McKeel thought could be connected to this case, he was ultimately cleared of any involvement. The pawnshop owner who identified him had simply made a mistake. A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes.
In 1989, 22-year-old Eloise Lindsay was a fresh college graduate, and she was at a crossroads in her life, because even though she just earned her degree, she really didn't know what she wanted to do with her life. And because she was an experienced backpacker, she thought a good way to, kind of get her life together would be to go on a sort of retreat, go out into the woods, go out into nature, and kind of find herself. So she had planned this very detailed 43.3 mile hike along the Appalachian Trail, starting in South Carolina, where the first 7 days of the hike she would be totally on her own, and then at the 7-day mark she would meet up with a friend at a particular rendezvous point. Her friend would give her resupplies and would be her companion for the rest of the hike. When Eloise told her parents what her plans were, they were not concerned for her safety because she was an experienced backpacker. She had made trips like this before. And so they said, great, we'll see you when you get back. So on November 4th, Eloise sets out to begin her journey down the Appalachian Trail. And the first couple of days of her hike were great. The weather was beautiful, the scenery was amazing, and she had all this time to just kind of be by herself and look internal and think hard about what she wanted to do with her life. But on the third day, when she woke up, she was sleeping inside of a tent she had camped just off the trail. She woke up and she had this intense sense of dread. She couldn't really place where it was coming from, but she knew something was wrong, and she's kind of doing inventory of her life, like, what did I forget? Is there something that I'm just not thinking about right now? But she kind of pushes it aside mentally and thinks, okay, you know what? I'm just going to pack up my campsite here and get hiking, and I'm bound to, come up with what it is that's making me feel this way. So she gets out of her tent and she begins packing up her campsite, and she's looking out, kind of scanning the tree line, not because she was looking for anything, but just because she happened to be looking out. And she could have sworn that she saw a man standing, 30, 40 feet away behind a tree. And she kind of did a double take and was staring at him. It's broad daylight, it's the morning, and they're near a trail, so it isn't like unbelievable that there might be someone near her at that very moment. But she kind of did a double take and she looked at them again, and this person was gone. And she stood there for a minute, just kind of looking in the direction of where she had seen this guy, wondering, is my mind playing tricks on me? Did I really see someone there? Why aren't they showing themselves again? If there was someone there, they clearly must have just been looking at me. Why aren't they, poking their heads out again to communicate with me in some way? We're out in the middle of nowhere. We should be talking to each other. But the guy never shows himself again. And so as she's standing there wondering what she should do, she isn't ready to yell out to this person because there's part of her that's a little bit nervous about yelling out to some stranger in the middle of the woods. But she starts to get this really intense feeling that she's being watched. And it feels an awful lot like the sense of dread she had while she was in the tent. And she's starting to wonder, are my instincts or is my sixth sense picking up that I'm being watched? Like there's some predator out there looking at me right now? And even though she has no way of knowing if that's actually true, she's alone in the middle of the woods. And even though she's experienced, she can't help but feel really vulnerable. And because this guy is just not showing himself again, she feels a little bit threatened. And so she begins to panic and she starts packing up all of her stuff as quickly as she can. And as soon as she can, she takes off down the trail away from that guy she saw in the woods. As she was walking down this trail, she couldn't help but think someone was right behind her. And she kept turning around to see if this person or whoever it was behind her, and no one was ever there. But this visceral feeling that she was being watched, that sense of dread she had, it just was not going away. And so she started walking faster and faster. Before long, she was running, and she's realizing that she's in a section of the Appalachian Trail that's very remote. She's not near civilization. She's not near her next rendezvous point. And so she's thinking to herself, I need to get off this trail. I need to get to a road. I need to get away from here as soon as I possibly can. And so her options were to continue on this trail for several miles, and it would probably take her until well into the night before she was going to reach civilization. Or she could take a shortcut because she believed there was a road that was running parallel to her trail, but it was way down the mountain. It would require leaving the trail and basically cutting through the wilderness to get down to this road. But she was pretty confident it was right down there. And because this threat of this person or thing following her was so intense for her, she decided to leave the trail. She couldn't stand the idea of having to spend another night out in the middle of the woods with this person stalking her. And so she walks up the trail and starts running down the mountain. It wasn't long before she started to hear audible sounds coming from what she believed to be this person that was following her. And she would turn around and there'd be no one there. And then she started to walk, trying to listen as she's walking, and she would hear footsteps far away from her, and she'd turn and there'd be nobody there, but she was certain someone was following her, someone was stalking her. And the sounds that were coming out of this person, this animal, whatever it was, they sounded like, a deep male voice, but you couldn't recognize if it was a language of some kind. It just sounded more like a grunt or a yell of some kind. And so her heart rate's elevated, she's panicking, and she's walking as fast as she can just through the middle of the wilderness, hoping she's walking towards this road. But after walking and running for miles into the middle of nowhere, she has not come to a road. It's now completely dark out, and she knows she's lost. And so she has to set up camp in the middle of nowhere, and she knows somewhere out in the middle of the woods is some person or something that is stalking me. And she's all alone. She has no way to contact anyone. She doesn't have a cell phone. It's 1989. And so she sets up her campsite and she gets in her tent, she zips it up, and she lays there hoping she doesn't hear any sounds. And sure enough, within minutes of being inside of that tent, she starts hearing those audible sounds coming from somewhere in the forest, and she hears what sounds like heavy footsteps walking around the perimeter of her campsite. All night long, she hears this. But luckily, they don't come up right to her tent. So there's some separation between her and whatever is making these sounds. And then finally, the sun comes up, she is out of that tent, packs it up, and continues running in the direction she hopes is the road. And of course, all day long, she has that sense that someone is watching her. She's hearing footsteps coming from behind her. She would turn, she doesn't see anything. She would hear that audible grunting sound, that low voice coming from somewhere behind her. But again, she would never see whoever it was or whatever it was that was making the sound. And then again, the sun is starting to set and she has not found the road. She hasn't found a trail. And she's thinking to herself, I can't even backtrack because if I turn around and start walking backwards, I'm bound to run into this very thing I'm trying to escape. And so once again, she sets up her campsite in the middle of nowhere. She gets inside, and as soon as she's laying in her tent, she starts hearing those heavy footsteps somewhere out in the woods, kind of walking around the perimeter of her campsite. She's hearing that low audible sound that she can't quite place. And at some point she falls asleep. She gets up the next morning, she jumps out of her tent, packs it up, and starts running, hopefully in the direction that will bring her to civilization. A couple days later, when Eloise was supposed to meet her friend on the trail at the 7-day mark and they were gonna finish the hike together, well, Eloise doesn't show up. But after several hours, when Eloise did not show up, her friend left the trail and contacted authorities and filed a missing person report. And the police would launch this massive search for Eloise along the stretch of the Appalachian Trail where she had said she would be. And for the next 14 days, hundreds of police and volunteers and helicopters are scouring this area, and there's no sign of Eloise. And so after 14 days from the time her friend filed the missing person report, the police had to turn the search off, and they say, look, we can't find her. 2 days after the search was terminated, so 23 days after Eloise had initially set off for her trek through the Appalachian Trail, a hunter that was out in the middle of nowhere near the Appalachian Trail discovers Eloise perched up against a tree. She's totally emaciated, she's dehydrated, she's delirious, but she's alive. At first, she was terrified of the hunter because she believed the hunter was this person that had been following her. But when she realized he was there to help, she went with him. She was brought back and brought to a hospital, and she was checked out. And besides being dehydrated and, emaciated, she was okay. And she would detail in multiple interviews and in her official statement that she had been chased for the past almost 3 weeks in the middle of the woods, and she doesn't know who it was or why they were chasing her. And then interestingly, she said right before she was found, so a couple of days before this hunter finds her, this person, this thing, whatever it was that was following her, got so close to her a couple different times that she was so scared she ditched her backpack that contained all of her life-saving equipment, like her sleeping bag and her tent, and it had some food and water in there. She ditched that so she could be lighter, so she could run faster away from this thing that is chasing her in the woods. So you gotta figure, you gotta be at such a high level of fear that you're prepared to ditch the one thing you really require to survive out in the wilderness, which was her pack full of supplies. And then after she's ditched her pack and she's run for some distance, she's got no supplies, no food, no water, she stumbles across this tree in the middle of nowhere that wedged inside the trunk is a cache of donuts and pound cake. And so she takes the donuts and pound cake, and between that and the stream water she had found, that's what kept her alive for the last few days before she was found. Eloise says she has no idea what to make of her experience, and law enforcement were baffled by it as well. Some people think Eloise had a mental break and she effectively made this whole situation up, that she really was lost in the woods, but no one was chasing her and she was just kind of paranoid and running around the wilderness for a couple of weeks. Other people, including park rangers that work that stretch of the Appalachian Trail, believe it's possible she could have been stalked by wild men, which are basically people that live out in the mountains that are effectively feral, that live off the land, and they've been known, according to local legend, they've been known to attack park rangers, and people that live out in that area have claimed to have seen these wild men, and they kind of match the description of what she was describing. But as of right now, there's no official explanation for what happened to her other than she got lost and was found again. On June 7, 1951, two families from Santa Fe, New Mexico met up at the Santa Fe ski basin to have a picnic together and to enjoy the mountain air. During the summer months when there's no snow on the ground, the Santa Fe ski basin is a very popular location for hikers because the terrain is very rugged, and if you get up to the top of the basin, there's these incredible views overlooking the valley. But on this day, the two families decided they wanted to have a picnic at the base of the basin, basically looking up the mountain. As the parents were setting up the picnic site, the kids started playing together, and that was Larry and Janet McGee, who were brother and sister aged 7 and 5 respectively, and Stephen Cross, who was 3 years old. After they finished setting up their picnic site, they look around and realize the kids are gone, and they're thinking, we just saw them like 2 minutes ago, so they can't have gone very far. And so they start looking around for their kids and they can't find them. They're yelling out for them, and they're starting to get a little bit more worried, and they start branching out farther and farther, and they realize the only other place they could have gone is up into the woods, which are very steep and very rugged. So they're thinking, well, they can't have gone into the mountains. That would be impossible for these young kids to get very far, and they aren't responding to our calls. It's possible they could have been abducted. And so one of the parents ran down to the main building of the actual ski resort where they kept a staff member in there during the summer months, and they were able to get inside and use a phone, and they called authorities. So the police come out and they set up these huge spotlights that are aimed up at the mountain. And so the idea was, if the kids did get up into the mountain somehow, they would see these lights and hopefully walk down to them. After they set up the spotlights, the police began combing the side of the mountain in hopes that the kids were not abducted. But despite the spotlights and hundreds of searchers and people yelling out for these kids, they never heard back from the kids. They didn't find them. And so all night they're looking for them, and they're realizing that there's a pretty good chance they're probably not here. And that means they probably were abducted. And so by the following afternoon, things were really starting to look grim. There was no sign of these kids anywhere. And that's when a searcher who was way outside of the primary search area, they were about 3.5 miles away, thousands of feet up in elevation. They're up there and they're looking around and they're getting ready to leave when they see something out of the corner of their eye that looks like a person. They turn around and one of the kids is poking their head up from behind a log. And the searchers run over to them, and sure enough, the 3 kids were actually inside of this downed log, and they were all okay. As the searchers are picking them up and calling this in, they're thinking to themselves, how in the world did these kids get so far away? Once the children were brought back down to the search headquarters and were reunited with their parents and were checked out by a doctor who said, yep, they're a little dehydrated, but they're okay. After all that was done, the police asked them the question that everybody was thinking: how did you get where you were found? And Larry, the oldest of the group, he was 7 years old. It took him a minute, but eventually he said, they were playing around the picnic area and they went just barely into the tree line when all of a sudden a bear came out from behind a tree and began chasing them. And the 3 of them ran 3.5 miles up a mountain to find this log, which they jumped inside of, and they hid inside of this log from this bear, which apparently was patrolling the area looking for them. And in addition to this bear that was apparently walking around the area looking for them, Larry said they were especially scared of the gorilla that was walking around the area looking for them as well. Now, it's easy to discount Larry and the kid's story because you could say, okay, well, the gorilla they saw was actually just a searcher looking for them. Except there was no one in that area looking for the kids near that log until right before they were found. It was kind of like a last-ditch effort to push outside the boundaries of the main search area. It was just kind of a miracle they actually located them. And Larry and the kids were saying this gorilla and this bear were looking for them on the first day and first night they were out there. So there were no searchers out there at that time. As for the bear, there have been bear sightings in the Santa Fe ski basin, although it is fairly rare. But if it was a bear that was chasing these kids, it would have caught them. A bear is not gonna not be able to catch 3 small children running uphill. So either there wasn't a bear, or it was some other animal that might have resembled a bear. But what type of an animal would chase 3 small children who are very vulnerable 3.5 miles up a mountain only to abandon them? But even if we say, you know what, there's no way the bear and the gorilla had anything to do with this. This is just kids who got lost and they wound up in the woods and they were found, and that's it. Fine. But I have a 3-year-old and a 4-year-old, and I can tell you right now, there's no way they could cover a 3.5 mile distance uphill in really rugged mountainous terrain in a 24-hour cycle. There's no way. Without help, that's not possible. I would say the only caveat to that would be if my children were fearful for their lives, in which case adrenaline would kick in, and they probably could cover that distance in a 24-hour period. That certainly lends credibility to the idea that Larry, Janet, and Steve were in fact running for their lives, and they had that adrenaline kick, and that's how they were able to cover that distance. But were they really running from a bear or a gorilla? We don't know, and there's been no further investigation into this case, and I think that's because the kids were found alive. The parents, the police, they're happy, and everybody moved on. From 2002 to 2006, Cullen Finnerty was perhaps the most successful college quarterback in history, winning 3 national championships and being named the Division II Player of the Decade. He was also perhaps the toughest college quarterback in history. Most quarterbacks will spend their careers looking to avoid getting smashed by defenders. Not Cullen. Cullen was 6'2", 240 pounds, and he would tell his teammates that he wanted to get hit, and he would hit back. and his coaches hated it about him, but his teammates loved this about him. Cullen was also famous for playing through injuries. His junior year in college, he broke his collarbone, and he didn't tell anyone, and he played through an entire playoff series that he won. After college, Cullen's professional football career was not nearly as successful as his amateur one. He played briefly for two NFL football teams, the Baltimore Ravens and the Denver Broncos, but when he wasn't getting any playing time and he just could see the writing on the wall that this was not going to be a match, he was not going to make it in the NFL, he left for Europe to play in a European football league. But when his European football career started to sputter out as well around 2009, he came back to the United States where he joined a very small-time indoor arena football league. And while Cullen's love of football was still there as much as it ever was, he knew at this point, playing at this low of a level, that his career was effectively over. Around the same time that Cullen was hanging up his football cleats, he would meet Jennifer, who would become his wife. She was an all-state volleyball player and in many ways was just as competitive and as athletic as Cullen was. They were kind of like a perfect match for each other. They married in 2010, and Cullen, this big man, big-time quarterback, was shaking and crying at the altar because he was so nervous and excited about marrying Jennifer. Because I think this was a really big turning point for him, where he was basically putting football in the past and starting this new life and building a family with Jennifer, and he was really excited about it. The newlywed couple moved into a house together in Michigan where they had 2 kids, and Cullen landed a good job in medical sales, and by all accounts, Cullen was just hitting his stride post-football. On Memorial Day weekend in 2013, Jennifer's family was planning this 3-day fishing trip along the Baldwin River in Michigan, and the Finnertys decided they would join them. And so Cullen and his wife and kids, they rented a cabin that was going to be near the campsite that Jennifer's family was staying at, and for the entire weekend it was just this great fishing trip where everybody had a great time and the weather was beautiful. And on May 26th, so the last night of this 3-day fishing trip, Cullen, who had recently purchased this pontoon boat that they had used for this fishing trip, he wanted to just go out one more time on his boat, this boat that he was really proud of, and fish for another 30-45 minutes before ending the weekend. So Cullen put on his waders and his jacket, he grabbed his fishing pole, and he had his family drive him to the stairs that led down to the water where his pontoon boat was. Before he walked down the steps, he turned and told his family that he'd be out for about 30 to 45 minutes and that he wanted to be picked up at the next boat ramp down the way and that he would call when he needed a ride. 42 minutes later at 9:27 p.m., Jennifer receives a phone call from her husband, and she's expecting it to be the call where he says, "Okay, I'm ready to get picked up." But when she answers the phone, Cullen is frantic, and he's telling her that he's being followed by 2 men in the tree line, that he's out on the water on his pontoon, but there are 2 men in the tree line that he can't see, but he can hear them, and they've been following him for some time. And before Jennifer can even get a word out, Cullen says to her that he's going to beach the boat and take his clothes off. And then he hangs up. Jennifer immediately tries calling Cullen back repeatedly, but he's not picking up, and so she's left feeling totally confused about what her husband has just told her. But what stood out to her was how scared he sounded on the phone. And fear was not something she typically associated with Cullen. This beast of a man, this tough football player, he didn't get scared. So for him to be that scared sounding and to be describing people basically stalking him, she knew he was in serious trouble. So she calls 911 and she describes where he is in the Baldwin River, and the police take her report and say, "We'll send someone out right away." After Jennifer got off the phone with police, she called her family and told them about this really strange phone call from Cullen and how she had just called the police and she didn't know what to do. And so her brother tried calling Cullen, and Cullen answered. And when he did, Matt said, "Hey Cullen, where are you?" And Cullen would say, "I don't know where I am, but there's these 2 guys that are still following me." And Matt would say, "Are you still on your boat? Are you on land?" And all Cullen said is, "It's getting pretty rough out here." And then he hung up. Afterwards, Matt would call Jen and he would tell her about this phone call with Cullen, and it really didn't add any clarity to the situation. And so Jen and her family decide the best thing they can do is go to the boat ramp where Cullen had said he wanted to be picked up, in hopes that maybe he would make his way there and they would find him. So Jennifer and her family head out to this location, and Cullen's not there. They get out, they're yelling for him. There's no sign of him, and shortly after, a police car would show up because this was one of the areas where Jennifer had said when she spoke to police that Cullen might be. And so the police officer gets out, they take an official statement from Jennifer, and at this point they file an official missing person report. Before the police began looking for Cullen, they reached out to his wireless service provider and they asked them to ping his cell phone from the tower. Any service provider has the ability to roughly triangulate the location of a cell phone based on the last few locations of the phone. The last 4 locations that the service provider pinged for Cullen were up to 4 miles apart from each other, which was bizarre in its own way, because the idea that in a very rugged, rough area in a very short amount of time that Cullen had been moving 4, 5, 6, 7 miles just to get to these different points, that didn't really make sense. But also when they looked at these points on a map, it looked like each of them was either near a paved road, or in order to get to them, you would have had to cross a paved road. And so they're thinking to themselves, why does he keep moving point to point if at any one of these locations he's near relative safety? But as strange as these 4 locations were, the police now had a really solid starting point. So they dispatched people to each of these points and they began combing along the river where he had last been seen. And within an hour, they discovered his boat. It was a little ways down from where he had been dropped off. It was missing an oar and it was basically beached on the side of the river. It wasn't clear if it had been intentionally beached, but Cullen wasn't in it, and when they searched around the area, they couldn't find any sign that Cullen was in the area. They were yelling for him. He wasn't yelling back. Interestingly, a man who owned property near where the pontoon boat was found reported to police hearing screaming or yelling coming from the area where the boat was found around the same time that Cullen went missing. But despite this piece of information, it didn't actually help them discover where Cullen actually went. For the next 48 hours, police and hundreds of people searched in the areas where his cell phone had pinged and along the river where his pontoon had been found, but there was no sign of him. Then, on the evening of May 28th, approximately 48 hours after Cullen had gone missing, they discovered his body. It was located less than a half mile away from a paved road, and it was situated in between those 4 points that the cell phone provider had given. He was laying completely face down with his right arm under his body and his left arm over his head, clutching some grass. When they rolled him over, he had some blood coming out of his nose, but besides that, there was no significant trauma anywhere on his body. Cullen appeared to be wearing all of his clothes. However, it was noted that the strap on his waders was really badly twisted. Now, if he had never taken his clothes off, that would have been something he would have fixed. It would have been very uncomfortable when he started this trip to go fishing. That would have been something he would have fixed. Now, he said to his wife on the phone that he was going to be taking his clothes off, which there was no explanation for that, but he clearly said that to his wife, and she reported that to police. And so some have speculated that between that phone call and finding him with the twisted strap on his waders, that indicates that perhaps his clothes did come off at some point over the past couple of days and were put back on again, either by him or by someone else. His cell phone had also been found in his front pocket, indicating that those cell phone pings had been his actual location. Initially, Cullen's autopsy was completely inconclusive. There was no trauma to his body. There was no obvious thing that killed him. But later on, it was determined he died of pneumonia caused by inhaling his own vomit. So we don't know how you get to a place where you're inhaling your own vomit, but I would imagine you're in a pretty panicked state of mind if that could happen to you. Many people believe Cullen's death was the result of a traumatic brain injury caused by all the years of playing football and getting hit in the head. And so that can lead to paranoia. And so perhaps this was a fit of paranoia. He got turned around, he got scared, he thought somebody was chasing him. And then, he vomits and inhales his vomit, and that ultimately kills him. And in 2011, Cullen had briefly shown signs of being a little bit paranoid when one day he thought someone was following him, and he actually went to a family member's house and said, "I think someone's following me," but he could never identify where this person was or who they were. But even if this was a fit of paranoia and no one was following him in the woods, well, why didn't he stop on the paved road every time he crossed it? Because that would have represented safety. I mean, in 2011, when he supposedly had another fit of paranoia, his instincts were to go to a family member and to seek help. And so you would think his instincts in this situation would be similar. He would seek help, he would seek safety, but he continuously left safety. He left the road. He left his boat. His boat was safety. Why did he leave his boat? And even if we turn this around and we say, no, it was not a fit of paranoia, that he was in fact being followed by someone or something in the woods, well then why would that prompt him to call his wife and say, I'm going to get out of the boat and take my clothes off, and then proceed to walk 4, 5, 6, 7 miles in a very short period of time, crossing over a paved road at least 1 or 2 times and not stopping, not signaling for help? That doesn't make sense either. And what was that screaming that resident heard coming from the area where the pontoon boat was found? Unfortunately, there are many questions in this case, and the vast majority of them will go unanswered.